Hello, good afternoon, everyone. This is Hoda Abdulhai. I am from the ATD Middle East show. Welcome to today's webinar. We're very excited to have you on board. So I just wanted to cover a few housekeeping points before we start. So as you all know, as we mentioned in our emails, this webinar will be recorded and we will send it to all the attendees after it has ended. This is also a webinar on a topic on blended learning, which we are actually running a certificate program for 2 full days at the ATD Middle East show this April on the 11th and 12th at the Le Méridien Hotel in Dubai, which will also be run by our webinar leader who's joining us today, Carrie Addington. And she's an internal ATD facilitator. She's actually joining us from the US, and she's very early where she is right now. She was happy enough to join us and put together this webinar as a small kind of get together of what she's going to actually be delivering as a certificate program in the show. So Carrie Eddington, she as I mentioned, she's an ATD facilitator and an expert in people development coach. She's passionate about delivering effective communication solutions, and she'll be joining us. She'll share her views on today's very topical subject of blended learning. I'm gonna switch it off to Carrie, who's joining us now from the US.
Hi, yes, thank you, Hoda. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning here and good afternoon there. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I appreciate those of you that have been looking at our warm-up activity to kind of give me a sense of where you're at. It looks like a lot of us are living in the A and B category of being new to designing blended learning programs and wanting some more information, or at least wanting to be a little more strategic. So thank you for participating there. So as we move through today, I want to officially welcome you to our webcast on blending learning models for your business needs. As we know, talent development professionals have been blending pre and post-program elements into training events for years. And while blended learning has been around for decades, the definitions of blended learning are quite varied. And so our aim today is to really leave with a better sense of what blended learning is and how to go about tackling our designs for new blended learning models. I want to take a quick moment and give you an introduction and also point out that my email is listed on this slide. I invite you to definitely follow up and engage with me even after today's session if you have any questions. I'm one of those people that I like to absorb things and think about them before I have my questions, so feel free to email me should you have those. Again, my name is Carrie Addington, and I'm delighted to be here to talk about this topic with you. I've been in talent development for more than 10 years as an instructional designer and facilitator, spanning a variety of industries. And my most recent experience has been with Estee Lauder companies, where I worked on educating across North America to a very geographically dispersed workforce. So a blended approach was imperative for not only our learners, but for our organization as a whole. So I have a genuine interest in this topic, and so I'm delighted to be here with you today. So let's take a look at what we're going to be talking about. Today's topics, we're going to start with an overview of just thinking about what is effective blended learning and what's a definition that we can really latch on to. And then we'll talk through some best practices and the various delivery methodologies, how to go about possibly selecting those, and thinking about the differences between our traditional instructional design approaches and our shift into designing for blended. And then we'll end with some tips for implementing a blended program, and we'll round out the day with some Q&A. I'll tackle some of the questions that you've posted and give you a nice special invitation that I have for you at the end of today's program. So again, as Hoda mentioned, this is actually pulled from a 2-day certificate program that we offer that is a very immersive experience, so that as an attendee of that program, you're able to not only work on designing your own blended program, but you are experiencing as a learner what an effective blended learning program looks like. So it's a very twofold in terms of benefit. So in our warm-up activity, I asked for you to define your relationship with blended learning, and a lot of us, it seems, are new to it and wanting some baseline information, or we've done a little bit, but we want to be a little more strategic in our approach. So a few thoughts to start us off. Blended learning has really captured the attention of many organizations as a very versatile and flexible learning delivery solution that's really going to be addressing a lot of today's business realities. And what I mean by business realities, this can include anything from tight training and travel budgets to a demand for reduced time of our learners away from their actual day-to-day jobs. Also changing generational and learning preferences. And we've got a wide variety of delivery options to choose from. So thinking about how we can really tackle those more strategically. Additionally, a blended approach is really about focusing on the learner first. So providing effective, meaningful, and well-timed experiences for the learner to really, really optimize that learning transfer. So blended learning, if we're thinking about a technical definition, this is the one that we offer in our program, and it's our guiding principle, is that blended learning is really that means to deliver just-in-time learning so that learners can start to apply knowledge sooner and even as soon as they acquire it. This is a paradigm shift from traditional kind of event-oriented, instructor-led classroom training. So it's a mind shift for sure, and we're going to talk about ways to navigate that change. But when developing blended learning programs, we have to keep in mind everything from technology to what our learning outcomes are going to be, to the organizational readiness to actually implement and employ these designs. So a true blended approach really needs to identify and document the requirements of the program as well as the intended audience from the onset. Very similar to how we're designing our traditional instructional design programs. One caveat here is that organizations that don't take into consideration their company culture, varying learning styles, any global and cultural preferences and technology familiarity can start to slow the momentum of their blended program before they even begin implementing. And so we're going to talk about some best practices to avoid that as we move through today. But the aim here in a blended program is really to design a scalable approach that you can build onto over an extended amount of time. Another kind of shift in that blended learning model is that in a blended model, the facilitator acts more as an anchor, kind of reassuring participants that there's support and reinforcement and assessment readily available depending on what part of the program they are experiencing at any given time. Good, so let's talk a little bit about the benefits of blended. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, as much as it is focusing on a few of our top benefits of blended that we don't always consider. Just to move quickly through these. When we look at intentional, so when we talk about being intentional with a blended design, it's really requiring participants to be very self-directed in their learning and in their approach, which can be a fundamental philosophy change. So thinking about being intentional not only in the way we're designing it to encourage and motivate and engage those learners, but thinking about how we're going to be intentional in the design to provide assessment and feedback and follow-up. Also, I want to talk about the second and third bullet here of flexible and scalable, which that language is very similar in nature. And so I want to point out the difference here. When we talk about being flexible in our blended designs, we're really speaking to that notion of kind of bending something without actually breaking it. So just making it a little more flexible and moldable. And I really think of the benefit of being flexible in a blended program in that we can make quick adjustments as we're rolling out the program to make sure that we're meeting the learner's needs. So when we think about blended being a learner-centered design, that flexibility is key. It's making sure that what we're putting together is going to meet those needs. So again, flexible meaning very short term as we're looking at designing the program and moving along, bending something without breaking it. So let me give you an example here. So I mentioned that I had some experience with Estee Lauder companies in North America, and we had a new hire training program for our field sales representatives, which were representative of all of North America, very geographically dispersed workforce with varying levels of expertise. So the audience was varied, as well as their technical expertise in terms of technology and how to interact with technology. And what we found was that blended was a great design because we had options pre and post classroom training that were meant to support and be flexible enough to mold depending on each audience type. So for instance, before we had our new hire classroom training where we bring everybody together in one classroom environment, we had a podcast that before the classroom portion, they were listening to the podcast at their convenience. And that actually gave them a baseline of knowledge so that when they showed up at the classroom, we knew that all of our participants and our learners were on the same level of knowledge because they had completed that podcast. Okay. So that's just one example of thinking about how to be flexible and adapting and kind of moving along. Scalable is really thinking about a change in size or scale. So thinking about those building blocks of a program and thinking very long term. So we can be flexible within our design of a blended program, but we can also be scalable in the sense that we might have a 6 to 9 month plan of execution and thinking long term about where this program could actually build into and making it much more scalable. Meaningful and strategic, meaningful, thinking about very intentional and purposeful structure. So we're not putting a self-study portion into a blended program merely to call it blended. We are being very strategic and meaningful with why we're tying that in. And I think that last bullet of strategic is key here because we're thinking about how to tie to organizational goals and needs and really aligning with that big picture plan for the organization. There's a plan in place for learners and how they'll learn and the outcomes it will generate, but all of this is tying back to that organizational goal. And just as there are various benefits to a blended design, there are also various cases when a blended approach is appropriate. What you see here, again, not an exhaustive list, but just a sense of what we see most commonly, and that's everything from we need more just-in-time content to we need a reduction in costs and resources. To maybe we're just needing to focus on a more learner-centric design. Maybe our traditional design programs are not yielding the on-the-job results that we're looking for because our learners are not the focus of that design. So these are just some tips and some, excuse me, some benefits to that blended design that you might want to think about which resonates with your organization. Great. All right, and what we see here, now that we understand that definition for blended learning and some benefits and when it's best to kind of use that approach, this is just a few of the kind of most common deliver methodologies that we can consider in a blended design. And as you see here, this is everything from our synchronous and asynchronous e-learning to self-study to simulations, Are we going to provide them with performance support? And what does that look like? Does that look like ongoing discussion boards and portals, or is that performance support looking like job aids? Are we going to provide web-based collaboration? So are we going to engage them on social networking sites that start to use maybe chat bots to start making sure that they are following through with some of the activities that we've given them from a self-study perspective? So these are just a few of those delivery methodologies, and a variety are listed here, but with so many options, we can kind of sometimes wonder if we're choosing the right blend. How do we choose the right blend? And this is a common struggle that I've heard for years from many of my participants, that, you know, I feel like I'm just grabbing a few, putting them together, calling it blended, and I'm not really sure what is the best methodology. A good rule of thumb is to ask yourself which modalities will best serve the content and the learner simultaneously to produce the desired result. So we're thinking about what's going to best serve the content of the program as well as the learner. And that will help us focus in on what those delivery methodologies may be. One thing I do want to point out when we think about these methodologies, we've got our more self-directed, and there's various listed here in terms of the self-study and the asynchronous e-learning modules. Anything that's a self-directed activity for our learners, we want to make sure that we're linking it to another part of our blended program so we can ensure that learners are actually completing it correctly. So sometimes we can see those self-paced e-learning modules where we're speeding through and we're hitting the right answers, but we're not necessarily learning the material, and there's nothing that's assessing to make sure that we now have that knowledge to put into practice back on the job. So thinking, are we going to have them complete a workbook and upload it onto the LMS to receive feedback? Are we going to have them provide feedback for their peers? Maybe they're going to have an on-the-job training coach. So just thinking of the different ways that we want to hold our learners accountable for those self-study portions. Using a chart like this that you see on the screen now, great place to start as you think about what delivery method is recommended and when. And this just kind of gives us a big picture oversimplification. It's obviously there's a lot more delivery methodologies out there, but these are the four most common. And thinking of, you know, if we move quickly through this list, the instructor-led classroom, this is great. From the standpoint that depending on your audience, it might feel more productive for them because it requires teamwork in the same physical space, excuse me. So we need to make sure that if we're doing that instructor-led classroom training, that it's serving that purpose where we really want to bring some people together. So going back to my former example, when we had our new hire sales training, we still wanted to have the delivery method of instructor-led classroom for that second bullet that you see listed here. The team building, we had disparate groups of people that were not working together except over email and phone. So we needed to build that team and really provide them a physical space where they could learn from one another. Moving to that virtual instructor-led training, so something that's more of that Adobe or WebEx platform where we're really engaging, but just from a virtual platform. So great for geographically remote employees, great for global trainings. And we tend to do the virtual kind of synchronous instructor-led trainings as opposed to the self-paced because there might be complex content or engaging and interactive content where it requires a facilitator to answer questions immediately and really engage those learners. Which brings us to our next delivery method of e-learning, and that's self-paced. So this is where we might have a lot of knowledge-based content. Great for regulatory compliance training, something where we need to get them the information, but there doesn't need to necessarily be a lot of engagement. And then the final, that performance support. So anything from online content that we're going to provide them to job aids, to interactive PDFs, to podcasts, anything that's a just-in-time knowledge or skill refresher. So thinking of just looking at these four and thinking of how you could start to blend them, I want to show you a sample blended curriculum design. And this is interesting for a number of reasons. I want to direct your eye to the bottom of the screen where you see the V, W, and C, the key there that's showing you that you've got your virtual session components, you've got your web modules, and then you've got your classroom session. And so very visually, we can look at the sample curriculum design and see that, we've got in month 1, month 3, and month 5 through 6, we have a classroom session. So every other month, we are doing a classroom session to reiterate all of the virtual and web modules that are taking place pre and post. So we start to see how this visually can start to be very flexible and scalable. I might look at this and say, I don't have enough of the web-based session. I want a web-based in every single month, so maybe I'll add that in. And thinking about why and how that's going to tie to the content that exists in every other section. So this is just giving you a little taste of what that sample blended curriculum design could look like. Great. And just like traditional instructional design suggests that we begin acquiring stakeholder buy-in and support from the get-go, when we're doing our needs analysis and our design documents, we're really starting to obtain all the buy-in from all of our stakeholders and everyone who's going to partake. And an important component to any blended model is to acquire that support. So this may mean reaching out to your employee development staff, your trainers and instructional designers, any managers, frontline managers of your learners, any technology support staff, to really start gaining an understanding of what resources are available and how you can move forward in the most effective and efficient manner. So when obtaining support for your blend, there's a few benefits to highlight, and that includes when I usually am trying to get buy-in on a blended program, especially if someone is used to a more traditional approach, I'm going to start by focusing on the fact that it's a more learner-centric design. So it's giving a more flexible approach to our audience to give them what they need when they need it to help make a difference when they get back on the job more directly and quickly. I also focus on convenient access to training. So this is obviously reduced cost for employee travel and expenses, but reduced cost for the resources of doing everything in an in-person classroom setting. So cost and time and resources, always great when we're trying to obtain that support, but then also focusing on the fact that it's a learner-centric design. And as with any learning program, there are potential points of resistance. So you see a few of the most common here. Again, not an exhaustive list. We could probably go on and on with some potential constraints or things that we can be up against when we are trying to design a blended program. Being able to really identify the constraint and that which might be a constraint in your own organization is half the battle, just so you can allow yourself some time to plan on how you're going to overcome that objection. So maybe the technology, that fourth bullet you see here, technological, maybe that's a constraint. Maybe you don't have the technology to support your blend. So maybe your suggestion is a short term looking at what's available to you, and it might be something very simple. If you don't have an LMS, it might be some other web platform where you might have some of that Web 2.0 where you've just got that informal learning happening over a Skype session. And we're really starting to build that technological breadth, if you will, and thinking about what to ask for. So what I find is that when I am thinking about the potential constraints I'm up against with any of these programs when I'm designing them is I'm thinking about, okay, if it's a technological constraint, I'm going to say, here's what we can do now, and here's what would be ideal. How can we get there, and how does it impact the learner, which then impacts the organization? And that helps me more strategically prepare for those conversations when it comes time for implementation and rollout. So just a few constraints to consider. Also, best practices. So when we think about questions to ask, these are just some suggested questions that we like to ask, just to kind of almost gut check ourselves and say, why is blended learning being considered? Why are we considering it at all? What is the need here? Or are we just doing it to do it? Also thinking about what needs to be learned and who the learners are. Really getting to know who those learners are and what their limitations are and what their strengths are and how we can really make it a program that is catering to that learner. What technology is available, we just spoke about that, but also, does content already exist? I love that question because sometimes I've been designing this great piece of content and I find out from another department that it actually already kind of exists and I could have just adapted it for the training. So thinking about, as we think about not only leading into our implementation process, but the constraints, these are good questions to start asking of all of our stakeholders and all of the parties involved in the potential design of the blended program. One model that we discuss in this program as well is the 4 C's to implementation success. 4 C's are listed here on the screen, and what we're really talking about is that this helps us promote the success of a blended implementation. And we go into these quite in depth in the program, but the theory here is that if you plan for each of these in advance, you can really start to mitigate any of those barriers that might pop up. So really, there's a very similar mindset amongst all of the 4 C's to implementation success, and that is that there is the common goal, and we're really trying to support by understanding, hey, we're going to communicate with each other. We want to build a sense of community, which really blends into that culture. And does the culture support what we're trying to design in this program? And then control. So we can really think about, okay, how are we going to roll this out? How many months will it take for us to roll this out? What technology is available? What resources? What are our costs? So really thinking about these 4 C's, it can really start to guide how you're going to actually roll out and implement that program. And we've got some best practices for this as well. Again, beginning on a small scale. So thinking of that flexible approach and that flexible benefit of a blended learning program, and thinking about how can we begin very small and start to build out. So for instance, in my example from earlier, when we rolled out our new hire sales training and it was a blended program, we rolled it out to a small subset of our new hires. So we had a total of 32 new hires, and we decided to roll it out to a select subset of 10. And we chose that very carefully and almost operated it as if you would a pilot in a traditional program, and really started to get that feedback, that formative feedback as we moved along to understand where we might need to focus more and what may not be working. And what we found was that part of our blended delivery methodologies, one of them was some self-study that wasn't proving to be helpful to our learners. So we were able to be flexible, we were able to adapt and change that before rolling out to our larger audience. And that, of course, identifying your goals and outcomes from the onset, we know that's imperative in any design process. Focusing again on the learner's needs. You've heard this as an underlying kind of mindset and mantra as we've moved through this entire webinar in this program, is that it's all about the learner. Involve IT in the planning as early as possible. You do not want to plan to do a podcast and have no equipment ready to create a podcast, and then you've got a great plan and a great program, and there's components of it that you cannot support from an IT perspective. So get them involved early. They might even save you some research and some legwork time. And seek external expertise when necessary. I'm a big proponent of this one. There are things I am not great at. There are things that I know are not my strength. And when I can, and if I have the resources and the budget available, I'm going to seek that external expertise to get them in there. So especially on your first, if you're thinking about those of you that answered A to our warm-up and said, you know, I've not really done this yet, but I'm interested in getting information. Start small on that small scale, but also get some external expertise. So can you get someone that has experience designing blended programs to consult with you? Is that in your budget? It may or may not be. Sometimes that external expertise is just reaching out to different resources. Different articles and blogs. This is a common topic in the learning and development profession. So you can find a multitude of resources. And we at ATD in our program that this is pulled from actually provide a lot of those resources for you just to kind of set you up for success as you get started on a blended program. A best practice is making the case for how a blended approach will positively impact the organization. And I just want to reiterate and stress here, we know this from traditional instructional design, but it's even more important in a blended program because there might, not always, but might be a little resistance to that shift in mindset to really start building the case, the business case for why blended learning makes sense for your organization from the onset. Excuse me, a best practice is making that case of how it will positively impact the organization. So what does it mean to the business at the end of the day? Get support first, then build your blend. Sometimes our instinct is to start building the blend to prove that it's necessary, and we might be doing a little extra legwork there. So get that support first, then start building the blend, excuse me. What we see here, the three components of the business case, again, this is something that we go into in depth in the certificate program, is really that executive summary of making that rationale, that business case for why we're even considering blended and how it benefits not only the learner, but the organization. Supporting documentation, this could be everything that you've collected in your needs analysis phase. So talking to all of your stakeholders, talking to potential learners, talking to anyone who can give you information that's going to make your case for what your educational costs for this program are going to be, but also the opportunity costs. So thinking about how this can translate into a return on investment, and getting that support documentation. I always say that in that supporting documentation, it's great to think about, in our previous slide, we were thinking about what are those potential constraints to implementation. So if you identify technology as a potential constraint, then put something about technology into your supporting documentation, because you're really starting to answer the questions for all of your stakeholders and interested parties that you need support from before you've begun. And then your request. Your request is explaining what your curriculum is going to do from a very high level, and then what your needs are. This could be timing, this could be resources, this could be finance. So it's a variety in terms of what your request is, but ask for what you need. And I usually say ask for more than what you need so that you can actually end up getting what you need. What this really, the three components of the business case really start to answer that question of what do you need to turn your blended design into a reality? And one thing I just want to kind of tease you on a little bit, this is something that can be slightly overwhelming, but I will walk you through it. This is a great tool. It's a model that we actually use in our 2-day certificate program to really guide us So for those of us that are doing, as we think about traditional instructional design and using that, whether you're using an ATD model or any other model to kind of give you that linear and systematic approach to your instructional design, this is a process that we use to design our blended programs. And really, if you look at the top, what that black box that says business goal, that is overarching the entire design process. What is the goal of the training? What is that business goal? And then we're thinking about each individual training topic. I will dive into our purple and our green and our red and our orange in a moment. But before I do, I want to just kind of point out the two fundamental differences that exist in a blended design as opposed to a traditional instructional design process. There are two major differences. One, much of the training in blended becomes very self-directed and learner-focused. And two, the blended instructional design process is quite fluid compared to the more traditional and linear instructional design process. So if you're familiar with the ATD model of instructional design, it's starting with that phase of analysis before we even move into design, and then doing design before we move into development. And so following that step-by-step linear process, where in a blended approach, it's very fluid, it's very flexible, those benefits we talked about in the beginning of today. And so just noting that that's the big differences between the two design processes will help you as you move forward in thinking about how to start your process. One other distinct difference that I think about when it comes to blended and how it's different than traditional is that we're really working from the enabling objective level. And so you see that purple box where it says objective and enabling objectives. And just as a refresher, typically in a traditional instructional design program, we might have a lesson objective, and at the end of that lesson objective, that's a terminal objective. So at the end of that lesson, they can absolutely do what is required. We're not focused as much on enabling objectives. Blended really focuses each delivering modality on the enabling objectives. So let me give you an example. If I'm designing a blended training for a sales force, for a field sales training program, and my objective is that at the end of that training, I want the learners to be able to target high potential customers. That's at the end. An enabling objective is that they need to be able to describe the characteristics of a viable customer. If I want them to target high potentials, they need to be able to define what a high potential customer is. That is an example of an enabling objective. So I might choose to have one of my various blended delivery modalities tackle that topic of them being able to describe the characteristics of a viable customer. So that gets into how the design process is slightly different. What these green boxes that say links are, these are basically just focusing on that mindset of whatever you're doing in one delivery modality, it needs to tie and link to the content in other modalities so that everything's really talking and working and building on one another, interacting with one another, as opposed to being very disparate parts. Great. So that's a great tool that we go into a little bit more in the program, a lot more in the program. And as we start to wrap up, I'm going to start to scroll through questions here in a moment and take some time with that. But the best way really to design an effective and strategic blended learning model for your business needs is to experience blended learning in a fully immersive learning experience, so that you can get the experience of what effective blended learning might look like And then additionally, on top of that, get that experience of getting to work with a program that you have in mind and really work through how to either turn it into a design. Maybe it's an existing classroom and we want to turn it into a blended program, or you want to create one from the ground up. So through pre-work, classroom, and follow-up, a participant comes away with an understanding that blended learning is more than just self-study and asynchronous e-learning modules. So with that, I would like to extend a personal invitation to all of you. I would love to continue this conversation with you and invite you to participate in our ATD certificate program on blended learning models. You're going to notice the title is slightly different because it is a 2-day program. So here we get into actually designing customized blended learning models for your business needs. So you're working on an actual program in that 2-day workshop, and you start that process so that you can leave with kind of the ball rolling, if you will, and get your wheels turning so that when you get back on the job, you're ready to go. I can tell you that I will be in Dubai in April. I'm very excited. It's my first trip to the Middle East, and I am excited and would love to see some of you there and continue this conversation. So with that, I want to come up to, and Hoda, if I can invite you to come off mute. I'm having a little trouble. I cannot actually see any questions, though I know they are there.
Yes, if you actually open the question, can you hear me, Carrie?
I sure can.
Yeah, so there is a question bar on the side. If you can, I can read out a few of the questions that was started off. So this is a question from Maha Khatib. She's asking, is there an organization culture readiness tool we can use to access if we can implement blended learning?
That's a great question. Thank you, Hoda, for the assist there. As far as an implementation tool, in our certificate program, we give you some checklists and some best practices and some questions that are great to ask that can start to guide that conversation and lead you into fleshing out some of the questions that are more specific and more customized for your own individual culture of your organization. So yes, absolutely, those tools are out there, and they are a part of our resources from our certificate program. So yes, also there are a lot of resources out there on the web as well, if you do, just doing a little research. So if you want to follow up with me in email, I'm glad to follow up with you on that more specifically.
All right, and Mahaseth, thank you. And then we have another question from Muhammad Ammar, and his question, I believe, are there any two different types of delivery methods for blended, or are there it's just kind of a combination? I think that's what he meant by his question.
Yeah, I'm starting to very slowly see these questions in a very slim window here, but I can see that any two types of delivery called blended. I think what that question is asking is lending to this mindset of is how many different types of delivery modalities do we need to have to call it blended? And it's a very good question. Some people would argue two or more. I would argue it's not about the number as much as it is choosing the appropriate delivery modality with the learner in mind and the content in mind. So it may be 2, it may be 8. It depends on not only your learners and your audience, but the content and what we're trying to achieve. So it's a little bit of an it depends answer, which I know is not extremely helpful, but there isn't necessarily the industry. There's a lot of research out there that says anywhere from 2 to 4 is considered a solid blended design. But there are plenty of people who argue with that as well.
I think there are 2 questions that came in. And I think we can end this. I think there's one from Ahmed Tired. Can you see them, or would you like me to read it out?
It's a very slim window that I can't maximize. So if you could read them, that would be most helpful, Hoda.
Of course, yeah. So Ahmed Tyer asks, is it overlapping with the learning design certificates or totally different? I have attended the learning design before.
Oh, okay. This certificate program. I believe what's being asked is the Designing Learning Certificate Program is our 3-day course that we offer, where it's essentially using the ATD model for traditional instructional design to really walk you through that process of using a systematic approach of instructional design to build a learning program. In that certificate program, the Designing Learning Certificate Program, which was referenced in the question, there is about a 2-hour segment on blended learning. So what this is doing is taking that 2-hour segment and blowing it up into just focusing on blended learning and how you can design a customized program for your business needs. So it's taking similar concepts, but it's really focusing solely on blended learning. A great question, though.
And I think the last question of the day is from Hussam Ghanem, and he says, would you know if there is a demand for blended learning in the Middle East?
Great question. Yes, I will tell you that when we think about the programs that we bring to the conference, we're really thinking about what people are interested in, what people are asking for, and yeah, I mean, in a short and easy answer, this program is because there was a need and a demand for it. So yeah.
Yeah, and to add to that, Carrie, also from my side, obviously we do a lot of extensive research with the market because we run obviously with ATD, the ATD Middle East Conference, as well as ATD standalone trainings, which are kind of either 3-day long or 4-day long, and one of our most in-demand training courses and actually a certificate program that Carrie is doing is blended learning. So yes, to answer your question, Hussam, that is in terms of kind of the market and the L&D community, blended learning is very much a subject that a lot of companies are looking at in the Middle East.
Yeah, thank you for that, Hoda.
And I think that ends our webinar for the day. Thank you very much for everyone that joined us. Thank you very much, Carrie. It was very enlightening and very insightful.
Absolutely.
So this is fantastic. Thank you for kind of giving us, I believe, would be a very interesting sneak peek of the 2-day extensive program that you're going to be running at the show. Thanks for all your questions and interaction with Carrie. We will be sending around an email in the next couple of days with the actual recording of the webinar, so you can take a look at it, and also more information on Carrie's session. And I think that's pretty much it. So let us know if you have any further questions at all. And thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you. Have a great evening, everyone.
Goodbye.